So I knew already early this week what I wanted to speak to you about this evening because I've just come back from spending a few days in Washington where I was attending as a delegate to this year's AIPAC Policy Conference. It was my first time attending the policy conference. It was an extraordinary and unforgettable event for myself and honestly for our nation, owing to the attention that the policy conference and its speakers have received in the press and online during these past few days. Before I get into the details and the content of the policy conference, I just have to acknowledge what an extraordinary thing it was, what an unforgettable experience to have been a part of a gathering of that size and strength, to watch the diversity and the richness and the depth of all of those attendees all together advocating in their own special and unique ways to maintain the strong relationship between our country and the nation of Israel, now and for many years into the future. It was, by all accounts, an unforgettable and unprecedented gathering, bringing together some 18,000 people from the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community in our country and beyond the boundaries of our country to speak up and speak out for a long-lasting and warm relationship between our two countries. So I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to have been, to have experienced it, and to share with you some of the things that I saw and learned and carried back with me to Houston. And I'll admit that I was eager to attend in part because I'd also become quite aware, as I know many of you had as well, about those conversations in the press and online about the controversy that surrounded AIPAC's decisions about who to invite to speak at the event. As you know by now, no doubt, AIPAC this year maintained its practice and policy of extending invitations to elected government officials in our government, to representatives of the current administration, and also to this year's presidential candidates to address the crowd and to say a few words about their positions on the all-important U.S.-Israel relationship. So I have to repeat and reemphasize that, again, AIPAC wasn't doing anything different this year than what it had done in the past. But even so, it was this process of issuing and managing the invitations to political figures that stirred up so much energetic debate about, and in some corners, angry opposition to, the organization's leadership and its decision-making. Those arguments all pretty much centered on one thing: AIPAC's decision to include one particular Republican frontrunner on its invitation list. Now, I have to emphasize that again because, as the polls and the primary returns tell us unequivocally, Donald Trump remains the presumptive GOP nominee this year. And so AIPAC's decision to invite him was well in keeping with the way that it does its work, capably and confidently, year after year. Nevertheless, there were and there still are a lot of loud and insistent liberal voices in the American Jewish community insisting that Mr. Trump is utterly unlike any other presidential candidate in American history, and as such, AIPAC bore no responsibility or expectation to treat him like every other candidate. So those intense feelings led to multiple and at times conflicting calls from friends and colleagues of mine, progressive rabbis from across the denominational spectrum, Reform and conservative, Reconstructionist and Orthodox rabbis who spoke out and spoke up to offer concern and anxiety about his invitation and urging me and my rabbinic colleagues to take action opposing his appearance. One group reached out to call for a walkout, encouraging delegates to boycott his speech altogether. Another group announced that they would stand up at the beginning of Mr. Trump's speech and then turn their backs on him for the whole time he spoke. A third group, whose plan I have to believe was quickly quashed by the overwhelming presence of Secret Service at the event, was working on devising a way for dozens of people to smuggle in Purim groggers to drown out the speaker every time he opened his mouth. So even before my plane left Houston, I'd received a number of messages asking me about what I was going to do on Monday evening when Mr. Trump was invited to the stage. And so I want to spend part of my time this evening answering that question. But before I do, a word of preface. I need to remind you that as a rabbi of this synagogue, it's not appropriate for me to advocate for or against any candidate for elected office. I've taken a lot of pride during this year's presidential campaign and in everyone I have seen since my ordination as a rabbi in keeping my personal politics personal. And I have to say that I feel a small inner thrill every time I find myself in conversation with one of you and it becomes obvious that you have guessed totally wrong about which candidate I support. My vote is as sacred and as secret as yours is, and I have every intention of keeping it that way. But because the hopeful candidates running for the highest office in the land appeared and spoke this week at the largest gathering of Jews in North America, I believe that there is an appropriate opening for me to share with you about what I did and why I did it, and why, for me, my choice was the result of careful and deliberate religious decision-making. And so on Monday night, when Mr. Trump took the stage and began his remarks, I stayed and I listened. I listened because I'm a rabbi, and to me that means that I am an heir of the Jewish intellectual tradition, which is one of the most sophisticated and well-honed in the history of human civilization. I listened because the centuries of Jewish learning are not enshrined in dogma that must be absorbed unquestioningly, but are preserved immaculately in reasoned and well-documented debate. I listened because Jewish thought builds its conclusions on evidence and debate. Centuries of Jewish study have taught us that you don't win an argument by being the guy who shouts the loudest. The cliche that we Jews love to argue emerges from the fact that when we hear something we disagree with, we don't walk away, and we don't turn our backs, and we don't cover our ears to drown it out. We stay, and we listen, and we engage with those ideas. We examine them systematically, and we debate their merits. Now, I'll tell you with some measure of personal sadness that my decision to stay and to listen didn't win me the admiration of many of my colleagues, many of whom insisted that Mr. Trump's ideas are beyond the boundaries of polite discourse and that he himself doesn't deserve to share the stage with his competitors, all of whom have won elected office at various levels of state and national leadership. They've insisted that Trump's rise to prominence, built on fear and anger against religious and ethnic minorities, recalls the darkest days of world history from the middle of the 20th century. But as emotionally sympathetic as I may be to that argument, I am intellectually bound to point out that this is not Nuremberg in 1934. Most importantly, because our Jewish community today has access to the most powerful tools of democracy, before which any aspiring politician is exquisitely vulnerable: the free press and the ballot box and the public square of political debate. Our Jewish community has reached a level of acceptance and success in this country that would have been unthinkable just a generation or two ago. Could your parents have imagined an arena full of 18,000 supporters of the Jewish state, addressed by the highest luminaries of journalism and academia, engineering and government, Could your grandparents ever have thought that the Vice President of the United States of America would have stood to address a gathering of thousands of Jews and with tears in his eyes repeat the words of Theodore Herzl, "If you will it, it is no dream"? And yet these things happened and more when I sat and listened during that conference. So when I came home, I came back to Houston inspired by the reminder about how closely Jewish and American national aspirations are entwined. I came back newly committed to engaging with big and important political ideas, the ones that I love and the ones that I shrink from alike. But the conference left me also with the germ of a new anxiety. Hearing the voices of so many Jews, of so many rabbinic colleagues, so many leaders of American Jewish organizations for the first time speaking publicly about their misgivings about institutionalized Israel advocacy in Washington makes me nervous indeed about what may be to come. Now, we have known for a very long time that one can be Jewish without being Zionist. The history of this congregation is clear testimony to that fact. And seeing that arena, that huge arena filled with thousands of pro-Israel advocates representing the broadest and most diverse political coalitions possible, Africans and African Americans and Asians and Latinos, American evangelicals and Arab Orthodox Christians, secular high-tech engineers and social welfare activists, reminded me unarguably of how clear it is now that one can also be Zionist without being Jewish. So as I said, I disagreed with their conclusions, but that one aspect of the challenges posed by my dear colleagues who walked out of that hall on Monday night deserves closer examination. Now that the circles of Zionist and Jewish support begins to diverge, as those two communities of support now start to pull imperceptibly apart, what are we to do now that those circles begin to tug against one another? What are we to do when one circle stands in opposition to the other? Well, I will tell you that we don't turn our backs on each other. We don't hang up the phone. We don't take our marbles and go home, because that's what it means to be in a relationship. We Jews invented the idea of covenant, in which mutual expectations inform mutual obligation and accountability. What more important setting is there for that idea than in the world of American politics? This candidate may be different from all other candidates. This campaign is certainly different from all other campaigns. But we Jews aren't new to this, because our tradition has cared about these questions for hundreds of years. I want to close tonight with an illustration from the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of that book, the final book in the Torah, when our scripture teaches us about how our nation will conduct itself when we finally are given the right to become a sovereign and self-governing entity, the Torah offers a few instructions for the person who seeks to be the king over all Israel. One of the most important qualifications required for a king of Israel is that in order to hold that office, he must personally write a copy of the entire Torah and keep it with him during all his days that he sits in office. Now, I have no illusions that this custom will be upheld when the new president is sworn in January, although I would love to see the custom compartment in Air Force One for the presidential Torah. The story leaves us with two important Jewish teachings. The first is the easy one, that there is an obligation for those who assume elected office. to conduct themselves and their office with a certain level of ethical carefulness, of moral rigor, inspired by the highest values of religious tradition. But the other is an implication for us as the keepers of the Torah. It's our job to make sure that the Torah remains with the king, just as it is the king's job to make sure that there is space for the Torah by his side. It is our job to use our voices in the press and the ballot box and the internet to make sure that Torah retains its rightful place in the halls of power and the minds of our country's decision makers. We have learned this week just how fragile those circles of coalition can be. The circles of Jewish leadership, the circles of Zionist leadership. And I'm reminded personally of how tragic it would be if one of those circles was used as a wedge to break the other. So when these forces threaten to pull us apart, to break our circles in half, our obligation and our commitment must be to clasp our hands ever tighter, to listen to each other, so that when the time comes, we can open our mouths and make our voices heard. Shabbat Shalom.